So today we wanted to provide some additional context about what the United States has been doing over the last several months to respond to the situation in Ukraine. Obviously, there's been terrible violence in eastern Ukraine, a terrible loss of life in the shootdown of MH17, and this is part of a broader conflict and crisis that we've been responding to for many months. It all began when the previous Ukrainian president, President Yanukovych, refused to sign an agreement with the European Union that the Ukrainian people very much supported. He was backed by the Russian government, and after months of protests against his corrupt rule, President Yanukovych actually fled the country to Russia, creating a political vacuum in Ukraine. So this began with the Ukrainian people rejecting a government that was solidly backed by Moscow. Then what happened is you saw a new government come to power through their parliament. And after that took place, Russia began its violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by annexing Crimea, a part of Ukraine where Russia already had military bases. Since then, the United States has been working on several tracks. Number one, we've been focused on working with our allies to support the Ukrainian people as they consolidate their democracy. Ukraine has a very difficult economic situation, particularly with this crisis. So through the International Monetary Fund and the assistance that we and the Europeans have provided, we are working to help stabilize the Ukrainian economy so that they can move forward. We've also supported Ukraine's democracy, and there's been great progress made these last several months. Even in the midst of this crisis, Ukraine has held democratic elections. They've elected a pro-Western president, President Poroshenko, and they have signed the agreement with the European Union that was at issue at the beginning of this crisis. So we have seen them, again, take steps, important steps, to advance their democracy and to improve their relations with the United States and with Europe. However, Russia has continued its violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, not just with its actions in Crimea, but by backing separatists in eastern Ukraine, some of whom are, frankly, Russian citizens themselves, and many of whom are armed and trained by Russia as well. So over the last several months, we have steadily ratcheted up the pressure on Russia through sanctions imposed by the United States and by Europe. And these sanctions have targeted individual Russians, officials, and cronies of the Russian government who are critical to the well-being of the Russian economy, but increasingly also entities in Russian sectors like the arms sector, the finance sector, and the energy sector as well. These are sanctions that are having a big impact on the Russian economy. We've seen Russian growth rates revised down to near zero. We've seen massive capital flight out of the country, nearing $100 billion. So Russia is feeling the pain from these sanctions. However, not enough to reverse its support for these separatists. All along throughout this course of action, we have offered an off-ramp to the Russians and to these separatists. President Poroshenko put forward a peace plan that would allow for immediate discussion and dialogue with the separatists in eastern Ukraine towards potential decentralization of power. The conditions for the ceasefire are that Russia has to stop the flow of weapons across that border and press those separatists to come to the table. But even though the Ukrainian government abided by a ceasefire, the separatists continued to violate it and Russia continued to arm the separatists. And that's the environment that was prevailing when the shootdown of MH17 took place. Now, we believe that this was a surface-to-air missile from Russian-backed separatist areas in Ukraine that was fired and hit MH17 and tragically brought it down. And that's why we made immediately clear after the shootdown that if Russia did not reverse course, it would face even greater consequences. Unfortunately, we still see Russia sending those arms across the border. We still see those separatists denying access to the crash site. And so President Obama has been working with European counterparts to formulate a strong response. And yesterday, we announced what that response would be. For the first time, the European Union joined the United States in sanctioning within sectors of the Russian economy. And they too focused on the arms sector, the energy sector, and also the financial sector. And what these sanctions are going to do in coordination with ours is impose a cost. So for instance, Russian state-owned banks are not able to access European and American markets. Certain technologies are not going to be able to be exported into Russia to help them develop their energy sector or help them advance their defense sector. This will have a broad economic impact in Russia that will significantly increase what the sanctions have already done to date. All of this is intended to show Russia that there is a cost for what it's done. and that there is a better way through de-escalation for them to resolve this crisis. And so that's where we are today. The United States is united with the European allies and with the other allies around the world, like Australia and Japan and Canada, who have joined us, and sending a message that we're going to stand up for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Russia is isolated. It does not have support for its position in the world. And frankly, its policies have only turned Ukraine further against it. So what began as a contest of Russia seeking to maintain its influence in Ukraine has only led Ukrainians to seek greater coordination and collaboration with Europe and the United States. At the end of the day, we do believe that Ukraine can and should have good relations with both Russia and the West. But that has to be on terms that the Ukrainian people and anybody should be able to live with around the world. And by that I mean a country should be able to determine its own destiny. They should not have their sovereignty violated in the way that Russia is doing so right now. So we will continue to ratchet up the pressure on Russia if they do not respect Ukrainian sovereignty. We'll continue to offer the possibility of de-escalation if Russia will come to the table in a sincere dialogue and stop its support in terms of arming and training these separatists. But the basic principle will be upheld, that we are going to support the ability of countries like Ukraine to make decisions about their own future. And again, the good news amidst all of this is that the Ukrainians are doing that they are building a democracy, that they are taking responsibility for their future. And we're going to continue to support them just as we've supported countries across Eastern Europe as they have made the journey towards deeper democracy, deeper trade and commercial ties with the United States and the rest of Europe. So this will continue to be a leading priority for the president. He's devoted a lot of time to it. He's been the focus of 2 of his trips to Europe. It's been the focus of our support to our NATO allies in Eastern Europe who are concerned about events in Ukraine. It will be a focus of the NATO summit that is coming up in September. But what we hope for is an outcome in which the Ukrainian people once again have control over their territory. They can resolve their differences peacefully with some of the separatists in eastern Ukraine, and they can have good relations not just with Russia, but also with the United States and Europe and whatever country that they choose to deepen their relationships with. Again, the United States will always stand for the principle that countries should determine their own future. That will continue to guide our policy in Ukraine.